Hello, everyone. What a pleasure and honor to be here with you at my favorite psychedelic conference. And I truly mean it. My name is Vincent Verroust. I'm from France and I'm doing a PhD in history of science. And I would like to gently criticize the concept of indigenous reciprocity. I would like to clarify that I have no conflict of interest, unfortunately, maybe. There is no multinational company paying me to criticize the concept of indigenous reciprocity. We have seen this concept appear relatively recently in a number of academic papers and websites in the global psychedelic space. And I think everyone knows that this is a project that believes that indigenous communities who have been using psychedelics for a long time should be compensated for sharing their knowledge and genetic resources with the Western world, and that they should receive their due share of the profits that are generated um, by the commercial exploitation of psychedelics, for example, by pharmaceutical companies investing in psilocybin as a psychiatric therapy. To clear up any misunderstanding, I would like to say at the outset that my personal political views are that drug production and the health system should be public services, and that I regret that the drug industry is largely in the private sector. I am also in favor of the disinterested sharing of the means that treat diseases that affect humanity. And now I would add that the concept of indigenous reciprocity sounds a bit absurd to me and probably reflects a problematic view of so-called indigenous peoples. Of course, while a concern for living in a world where ethics guide human behavior is, of course, a positive thing, I think that this whole thing about indigenous reciprocity is a bad idea, a concept that is perhaps more akin to a form of neocolonial paternalism than virtue in action. Actually, I already shared my critique of indigenous reciprocity last year at the ICPR 22 conference in the Netherlands, and I could see that the topic was quite divisive. When I arrived at the ICPR conference, I was a bit stressed, as I am now, to confess, and worried about criticizing the concept of indigenous reciprocity and being the bad white man who would do well to decolonize his mind. But I was even more worried when I realized on arrival that the conference had made this concept of indigenous reciprocity part of its public communication. I didn't win a tote bag when I bought my ticket to the ICPR conference, but rather a little paper explaining that the organizers acknowledge and honor indigenous people's responsible use of psychedelic plants for centuries and recognize that the global north benefits from their knowledge and feel it's important to build a process of reciprocity. Indigenous reciprocity is therefore an element of public communication, and I would not be surprised if it becomes a kind of greenwashing or indigenous washing for organizations or even commercial companies, like come tripping to our psychedelic treatment center and we'll plant a tree for a shaman, if you see what I mean. Mysteriously, not too much is said about the use of psychedelic snuffs as part of rituals to wish death on the babies in an enemy village among the Yanomamis, nor about the use of psilocybin mushrooms to cause harm to people among the Mazatecs by having them absorb small amounts without their knowledge, on the assumption that they are not in a state of ritual purity to absorb the sacred mushrooms, which is considered dangerous. Yet these practices of using psychedelics to harm others are described by ethnographers. But I don't know if they could be called responsible use by the proponents of indigenous reciprocity. I just would like to discuss ideas, okay? I'm ready to admit that I am wrong dealing with arguments. This is just a proposal for discussion. I humbly submit to you the fruit of my analysis. But for me, the concept of indigenous reciprocity is irrelevant. Basically, isn't there something dishonest about the expression indigenous reciprocity? Shouldn't we say reciprocity towards indigenous peoples? This figure of speech, which attaches an adjective to a noun when logic would dictate that the idea should be formulated differently, disturbs me. But English grammar is not my forte, nor English accent, obviously. So I leave you to judge. Now, rather than setting out my arguments with bullet points, which might bore you a bit, and I wouldn't like that, I propose that we use our imagination. Imagine that we have invented a process for using psilocybin that is very interesting and that we make a lot of money. And we decide to share our benefits with the communities where psilocybin mushrooms have been discovered. What to do then? Who exactly are we going to share our profits with? Off to Huautla de Jimenez, the famous village of Maria Sabina? No doubt. But there, who might be the beneficiary of our gesture of generosity in the name of indigenous reciprocity? The families of all the soothsayers and healers who use the mushrooms? Should everyone in the village receive their share? But what about all the surrounding Mazatec villages? Should these benefits be shared with all the Mazatecs? Furthermore, the Mazatec people are not the only people from whom Gordon Wasson collected samples. The American ethnologist who introduced hallucinogenic mushrooms to the rest of the world traveled through the southern zone of Mexico and collected mushrooms from Zapotec, Mixtec practitioners, etc. Should we then make an inventory of all the Mesoamerican peoples who were using psilocybin mushrooms at the time where they were discovered by Western scientists? There are two problems with this. One is intellectual property, and the other is ethnicity. I will start with the problem of ethnicity. What makes one Mazatec, Zapotec, Aztec, or whatever? As soon as you start asking yourself this question, you realize that ethnicity is not a very operational concept and that the contours of ethnicity are not always perfectly clear. What about people who live in a Mazatec village but have a parent from another culture, for example? The concept of ethnicity has been widely criticized and deconstructed by anthropologists, and there now seems to be a consensus that the concept of ethnicity is largely a contemporary creation linked to colonization, migration to the cities, and insertion into modern states. And if Wasson was interested in psychotropic mushrooms in the Mesoamerican zone, if we go back the chain of causality, it is because the European colonizers had observed their use at the time of the conquest of the Aztec Empire. So if we are to honor and thank the descendants of the indigenous peoples who enabled Europeans to discover and benefit from psilocybin, then perhaps we should go back to the 16th century and therefore include a large proportion of the current inhabitants of Mexico. Now, the question that is probably most crucial in terms of indigenous reciprocity: who owns the intellectual property rights to psilocybin? I'm asking this question for psilocybin, but the same question can be asked for iboga, ayahuasca, and other psychedelic plants and their active compound. So who owns the intellectual property rights to psilocybin? It is certainly well-intentioned to ask this question as part of an ethical reflection on the fair sharing of the benefits arising from the use of the biodiversity knowledge and practices of indigenous and local communities. But the issue of intellectual property is biased for several reasons. The French anthropologist Claudine Friedberg has explained it very well, and I will try to translate her thoughts. The question of intellectual property rights is perverted from the beginning if one accepts from the outset to set oneself within the perspective imposed since the Conference of Rio on Biodiversity, the process of commodification of the living world considered as unavoidable, with the economy and the law fighting over the exclusive rights of speech. The extension of the concept of intellectual property rights to traditional knowledge applied to plants and animals is part of a particular cultural context, that of Euro-American culture, since it implies the concept of individual property and commercial exploitation, which do not exist in all societies. It is the existence of the markets that makes it necessary to define who is the owner. In the field of traditional knowledge and expertise that has been collectively built up through generations, who owns what? If, as a result of globalization, all societies are forced to fit into our way of life through the market, this does not mean that they share its values. The issue of intellectual property and indigenous reciprocity would be in some ways a symptom of the acceptance of the generalized commodification of the world and of the absolute necessity to define a property on what for us are things, but which are not necessarily so for other cultures. Intellectual property is a gringo concept, and to project it onto indigenous peoples is to be ethnocentric. I recall, if you read Wasson again for the Mazatecs of the 1950s, psilocybin mushrooms grow where drops of Christ's blood have fallen to earth. Should we pay royalties on the fruits of Christ's blood? Moreover, historical and ethnographic sources indicate that psilocybin mushrooms were used primarily for divination and medical prognosis, and not so much for treating resistant depression, anxiety associated with diagnosis of serious illness, or for addictions, obsessive compulsive disorders, cluster headaches, etc. The Mesoamerican peoples do not share the same conceptions of health, of misfortune, of diseases, of their origin, of their treatment, as in the West. If psilocybin were to be patented for use in divination, that would be a real problem. In any case, I would like to emphasize that the people behind the discovery of psilocybin, the ethnologist Wasson, the mycologist Heim, and the chemist Hofmann, they cannot be considered as biopirates. I do not agree with the description of psilocybin research and drug development as a story of extraction, cultural appropriation, bioprospecting, and colonization. Wasson was not looking for drugs. He was interested in the relationship of people with mushrooms and the origin of religious feeling through the cult of the sacred mushrooms. The mycologist Heim was not looking for an interesting drug neither. He was a scientist who was passionate about the disinterested quest for knowledge and the naturalistic description of the living world. And the chemist Hofmann finally found psilocybin. He registered patents and he developed for Sandoz an experimental drug, indocybin, the commercial name of psilocybin. But now I may tell you something. I'm working on the archives of Roger Ames, which contains a lot of correspondence with Albert Hofmann and Gordon Wasson. So I read their letters. It turns out that once Hofmann considered that he had finished his chemical work on psilocybin, he proposed to Heim and Watson that they let the patents on psilocybin lapse. Heim and Watson accepted without discussion. I read their letters and they didn't beat around the bush. In 1964, Hoffman asked, "Do we now stop maintaining our patents on psilocybin?" Heim and Wasson didn't even argue. Their answer to each was short, "Yes, of course." So I'd like to see a little nuance in the narrative of the evil scientists dispossessing the kind Mazatecs. Now, since the issue of indigenous reciprocity and intellectual property starts from an ethical concern, perhaps it would be a good idea to ask whether there are indigenous claims to the fair sharing of benefits from medical research on psychedelics, or whether it's gringos speaking for the indigenous people in question. I mention the benefits of the medical research because I have never yet seen anyone hold the psilocybin truffle industry in the Netherlands accountable, which is probably a sizable market, by the way. I asked a Mazatec man from Huautla de Jimenez, Inti Garcia Flores, who is committed to keeping a historical record of his village and the discovery of the sacred mushrooms by outsider. I asked him if there are any indigenous claims of reciprocity. Inti Garcia Flores is a voice that brings a Mazatec point of view to the international level through his collaboration with foreign researchers and organizations. He is not a spokesperson. Anyway, this is what he told me. Reciprocity does not exist. These big psychedelic and pharmaceutical organizations only stick to a very romantic discourse about reciprocity. They use us in their speeches only to justify what they are doing and what is yet to come. It's really strange what's going on in the psychedelic scene. I think reciprocity goes further than asking for money. It's more about accompanying us in our struggles and defending the territory. End of quote. Last week, Inti Garcia Flores sent me a text message on WhatsApp to check up on me, and I told him I was going to critique the concept of indigenous reciprocity again at an international conference on psychedelics in England. And this is what he replied. I think that the word reciprocity is used by some North American and European organizations only as a way to justify themselves and feel like the saviors of the indigenous peoples. I will tell you that here in Huautla, many have arrived, including universities, with that theme of reciprocity, but they don't take into account that we, the people, have our own ways and so on. Before presenting this to you, I sent my text to Inti to know what he thought about it. And this very morning, I received an email from Huautla de Jimenez. So with his agreement, I pass on his message to you. The so-called intercultural dialogue is not something that has been demanded by the people. Same for the so-called reciprocity. In my opinion, this should come from the people and not from any organization, and even less if it's foreign. If we think that the region has been subject to various state policies and foreign organizations, which does not add up, but rather harm us, I believe that these organizations have not yet understood that the sacred mushroom is intertwined with other beings in the territory, water, cave, subsoil, and forests. I believe that if we do not preserve the territory, the sacred mushrooms can become extinct. And this has not been understood by foreigners. They only speak of reciprocity as they understand and interpret it. End of quote. So in the case of psilocybin, Reciprocity in relation to the intellectual property of the molecule and its use, apparently it's not a local claim. And it's probably not ethical to speak for indigenous communities. Don't you think that the narrative of indigenous reciprocity sounds more like a neocolonial paternalism, as if indigenous peoples should be taken care of, as if indigenous peoples were children? I assume this is perhaps the contemporary form of an ancient evolutionary vision of cultural diversity that treats indigenous peoples in a condescending way. This is why I think that these discourses about indigenous reciprocity reflect a problematic view of indigenous peoples. There are obviously peoples who are fighting for their sovereignty and the defense of their territory, but the use of psychedelics should have nothing to do with international solidarity. To come back and conclude on an inappropriate way, in my opinion, of considering indigenous peoples, I would like to mention the fact that very often we read or hear that ayahuasca or iboga have been used for thousands of years in the Amazon and in Africa. But on what historical or archaeological sources is this assertion based? It is quite possible that the recipe for ayahuasca was discovered only a few centuries ago, if we are to believe the work of the anthropologist Bernd Brabeck de Moray, while iboga may have been used since ancient times, but there is no scientific proof. So, to assert without proof that ayahuasca or iboga have been used for thousands of years maintain a false representation of the peoples of the rainforests as having no technical history. It is time to ditch the evolutionary vision of human societies, which places urban peoples of European origin at the tip of a temporal arrow, and which considers traditional societies as earlier stages of cultural and technical evolution that the former have surpassed, which would give the gringo peoples a role of protector, of savior, a paternalistic role. To conclude, while the concept of indigenous reciprocity in the psychedelic space may seem like a noble idea, it's important to acknowledge that indigenous communities did not preserve their traditions of psychedelic use for the sake of the Western world. It's probably condescending to thank them for something they did not do for our benefits. Furthermore, we must recognize that all peoples, not just those who use psychedelics, deserve international solidarity, social justice, and the defense of their rights. It's problematic to romanticize indigenous peoples who use psychedelics as if they hold some kind of mystical wisdom that needs to be protected. Instead of idealizing indigenous peoples who use psychedelics, let's work towards a future where all peoples are respected and their rights are upheld. Let's engage in meaningful and respectful dialogue with all communities and individuals, recognizing their autonomy and agency, and work together towards a more just and equitable world. Taking psychedelics may give us a sense of solidarity with our fellow humans and a hope for a better future, but ultimately, it's not the drugs we take or the drugs we worship that will create real change. It's our actions and how we treat people. Thank you for your attention.